Oh, alternating levels today. Hello, yeah.
So the next argument, again, we're going to stay in the broad family of ontological arguments for the time being, and we're going to talk about the modal ontological argument. It's a pretty difficult thing to kind of get into and discuss quickly. The idea is based around, it was originally formulated by Alvin Plantinga, and I guess I'm trying to think of the most kind of simple way of putting this forward.
Here it is. Premise 1. Possibly, there's a necessarily existent perfect being. Conclusion. This does follow in a pretty standard system of modal logic. Conclusion. There actually exists a necessarily existent perfect being. And that possibility is a metaphysical possibility. That's not just like epistemic. Like, for all I know, God might exist. Like, I'm not sure. That's not what we were talking about. We're saying there's a possible way that reality could genuinely have been such that this necessarily existent perfect being exists.
So let's break it down, because you're right that the simplest way of putting it forward crudely is to say the sentences, but most people upon hearing them are just like, what are you talking about? The argument is often, because even more simply, it's often framed as, if it's possible that God exists, then God exists. Premise 2, it's possible that God exists, conclusion, therefore God exists. That is a valid argument, but it just seems ridiculous. Why is it the case that if it's possible that God exists, then God exists? This relies on an understanding of necessity and contingency again in terms of possible worlds. To say that something is necessarily true is to say that it's true in all possible worlds. So we discussed earlier the idea that if something's necessarily true, it can't fail to be false. Possible worlds is a linguistic tool that's been invented by philosophers just to imagine the way that things could have been. So when I say that it's possible that this plant could have been blue, one way of representing that thought is to say there is a possible world in which it is blue. I don't think that there is actually like a multiverse, another universe that exists somewhere in which there's a blue plant, although some people take that view. It's just kind of a linguistic tool. When I say there's a possible world in which the leaves are blue, I mean that it could have been the case that these leaves are blue, but there is no possible world in which there's a married bachelor. There is no possible world in which 2 and 2 make 5. These things are necessarily true, which means that they're true in all possible worlds. Now, God is defined, for all intents and purposes here, as a being that if he exists necessarily. So if he exists, he has to have always existed, and if he doesn't exist, he can't come into existence. If he doesn't exist, he necessarily doesn't exist. So the question to ask then is quite simply, is it possible that a necessarily existing being exists? Now, a necessary being is one that exists in all possible worlds. But remember that when I said if it's possible something to be the case, it's the same as saying it is true in a possible world. If it's possibly true that there exists a necessary being, then that means that there is some possible world in which there exists a necessary being. But of course, a necessary being can only exist in all possible worlds or no possible worlds. And so if we accept the premise that it's possible that the necessary being exists, that means it exists in one possible world, but since it exists in all or none, if it exists in one, we know that it has to exist in all of them, which would include the real world. Therefore, this necessary being must actually exist in reality. Okay, thoughts?
Yeah, so there's a lot to say here. I mean, one thing you could do is you could challenge the underlying modal logic that applies to this. I mean, it's actually somewhat of a standard system that both theists and atheists alike are pretty cool with. I mean, there are theists who don't accept the system of modal logic. Modal, by the way, is just, modal logic is the study of valid inferences concerning possibility and necessity. So both theists and atheists, a lot of them agree with this underlying system of modal logic in which this inference is valid from possibly necessary to it's actually necessarily the case that something exists. But there are philosophers who challenge it. Nathan Salmon, for instance, is a philosopher who rejects and gives reasons for rejecting this underlying metaphysics, or underlying system of modal logic. But it is relatively standard, so that's not the move that most atheists would take. The move that most atheists would take is just to say, well, hold on a second, why should I accept that premise that it's possible that God exists? I mean, in this system of modal logic, you can see, because it's a valid argument, to assert that is, in essence, just to assert that God exists. Because if God possibly exists, then we just know it's a valid inference in this system that it follows that God exists. So why would the atheist ever grant that first premise? Why? I mean, to grant it is just to grant that theism is true.
Yeah, well, I think this is something you said earlier is very important, because most people, the reason why this seems so clever in first hearing is because when you say, is it possible that God exists? The first premise is possible that God exists. Most people go, yeah, it's possible that God exists, right? But the confusion here is that what they mean, they're getting at a kind of an epistemic possibility here. They're saying, like, for all I know, yeah, it could be the case. But we're not talking about that kind of possibility. As you said, we're talking about metaphysical possibility. So when we ask, is it possible that God exists, we're not kind of asking, like somebody might say something like, well, yeah, it's possible that he exists, it's possible he doesn't exist, so yeah, I guess it's possible. But of course, since God either necessarily exists or necessarily doesn't exist, you can't say. It's a bit of a philosophical party.
Which my argument ended up on the tier. Hopefully not S. Hopefully not at the bottom.
Aristotelian proof is only F. No, I'm kidding.
Colliding worlds, ladies and gentlemen.
90.
The universe.
Subscribe to everyone.
Yes, of course.
Except Cameron's.
Except mine.
We are, of course, currently in Houston, Texas, in order to take part in an event. I say current, I mean this will be probably well in the past by the time this actually ends up getting out. We're in Houston.
Houston.
Texas. Texas?
Texas.
That sounds like I'm saying taxes.
Yeah.
And we're in the company of Cameron Battisti and Brett Horn also. So that explains that little interjection. Where were we? We were talking
about the modal ontological argument, and basically I was saying to assert that first premise in the system at hand is essentially to assert God's existence. No atheist would ever grant that first premise if they're being a consistent atheist, and so it's just dialectically toothless.
So you don't think an atheist...
Let's try something easier,
the point is
maybe.
that for the atheist, well, any deductive argument is basically a restating of a conclusion in two premises, trying to make it, more plausibly acceptable in one separated. Yeah.
Oops.
So, could not the atheist sort of, upon thinking about it in these terms,
And
think to
with
themselves, well, I don't think God
different
exists, but then somebody says, is it possible that God exists? And they could be like, well, actually, when you put it that way, now they know that, yeah, if they
This is
grant that
boring.
first premise, they're basically granting the
I
conclusion.
don't need fucking
That's
stereo
just because the first
madness.
premise entails the conclusion. So what you're doing is posing a challenging argument, because the atheist will look at that and say, well, actually, maybe I do think it's possible that God exists. But if I do, then that entails that God does exist. So I'm not really sure of it. So of course no atheist is going to grant it after considering the argument and still being an atheist. But it's perfectly feasible that an
What do you
atheist could
do
hear this
though?
argument, grant the first premise, and in doing so become a theist.
Yeah, but the question is whether or not it really gives them a reason to do so.
I didn't
whether
have
it
to
gives
play
them,
poorly.
why? Why are they granting that premise? I mean, is it just impossible to them? I mean, this is where we get into kind of reverse ontological argument, because it seems though anything that they say with respect to that first premise could equally be said with respect to the reverse possibility.
Okay,
premise.
so let's
No, this
slow down
doesn't
to make
fucking
sure that
work.
everyone's on the same page. I'm sure your audience will be drenched in familiarity with this stuff, and so are mine probably. But for the sake of clarity,
No, this is cool.
much like how we constructed a parody of the Kalam cosmological argument to say, hey, if you accept the Kalam, you should accept this other argument which says God doesn't exist. We can construct, and there has been constructed, a parody of the modal ontological argument. We were talking about necessity and possibility. Consider the following argument. Is it possible that God does not exist? Now again, people might intuitively think, yeah, it's possible that God doesn't exist. But what that means is there's a possible world in which God doesn't exist. But God, being a necessary being, either exists in all possible worlds or no possible
No,
worlds.
this is cool.
And so if we find a possible world in which he doesn't exist, we know that he exists in no possible world, including the actual world. Therefore, God doesn't exist. So you have two parallel arguments. It's possible that God exists, therefore God exists.
Stop being this
And it's
guy.
possible that God doesn't exist, therefore God doesn't exist. And this is when we talk about, symmetry and symmetry breaking, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that these seem equally plausible, at least on first reading. And what we
Wow,
need in
this
order
is
to
cool.
defend the modal ontological argument is a symmetry breaker. We need to show why these arguments are actually not are actually not the same. Here's one way of doing it. We could say that if God is a necessarily existing being, if this is what God is being defined as, because Plantinga doesn't quite use the terms of God. He talks about like maximally great being, this kind of stuff. So we're not really talking about
This refined
God.
section is hard.
Of course we are, but we're avoiding that language in order to just establish something a bit milder, which is a necessarily existing being. If we say it's possible that a necessarily existing being exists, this makes sense. It might be kind of circular, it might presuppose the conclusion.
This is not wave
but it's
spam, come
consistent.
on.
But can you say, as you need to with the reverse modal ontological argument, it's possible
I need to
say
practice
it's possible
that.
that God doesn't exist is to say it's possible that a being that necessarily exists doesn't exist. And so actually the first premise of the reverse modal ontological argument doesn't get off the ground because you've just stated a contradiction.
No, you have not stated a contradiction. You're just saying it is possibly not the case that there exists an X such that X is a necessary being. When you're saying that it's a necessary being, you're saying if it exists in any world, then it exists in all. Right? And so if you're saying it's possibly the case that there is no such thing, all you're saying is that, it's possibly the case that there is no such thing, which is such that if it did exist
But
in any
this is
world, then it
possible.
exists in all worlds.
Just that
And that's not itself a
short.
contradiction. The way you put it was a little sly, but I know you're just trying to defend it. But so yeah, no, it isn't a contradiction. And to see that is just to say, like, let's just get the stronger claim. Then possibly there's no necessary being. Let's say there actually is no necessary being. That's not a contradiction. You're just denying that there's a necessary being. But you're still saying there isn't something which is in all possible worlds. Like when you put it like that, it sounds like a contradiction, but it's not a
So
contradiction.
shall we see what the slyness is, I think, is that I said God is defined as a being that exists necessarily. But that's not
Cool.
quite right.
Yeah.
I think God is defined as a
really?
being which, if
Epic.
exists necessarily. So if you say that God by definition is a being that necessarily exists, then you can't say that God possibly doesn't exist.
Let's try practicing this one.
Yeah.
But if you say that God is such a being that if he exists necessarily, then you can say it's possible that he doesn't exist.
And taking that first route is just disastrous, because you can define anything necessarily existing, and you'd be able to prove anything really.
Well, no,
I could just say that the necessarily existing cup is defined as that.
there's an interesting point. Can you do that? Again, there's another kind of response. This is a bit like the Cartesian ontological argument. People claim that Descartes just defines God into existence. And one of his contemporaries, I can't remember which one now, I can't remember who it was, but in the set of objections, talks about the existing lion.
Yeah.
Is it so?
Yeah. That was the guy who conveyed the information. That was like the messenger. He was like the Google of the day, basically. People.
At any rate,
Okay.
in Descartes,
It might have been him.
In response to Descartes' ontological argument, which he's accused of just defining God into existence, and you're saying here that if you take this first route of just defining God as a necessarily existing being, you can just define anything into existence that way. This was a problem was raised to Descartes. Somebody said, imagine the existing lion. The definition of this existing lion is a lion that exists by definition. And so this lion must exist, right? This seems ridiculous. Descartes had a way of getting around this by saying that you can imagine the lion without its existence, but you can't imagine the God without the existence because God is because it is a property of God. It's a bit of a weird way. I don't really like that. A better response might be to say, well, can you talk about the necessarily existing cup? Let's just try this. Let's just say there's a problem with defining God as a necessarily existing being. So I could just define the necessarily existing cup and then say it must exist. Well, what is a necessarily existing cup? Well, it's a cup that exists in a possible world. There's a possible world in which there's no matter. And so if this cup is necessarily existing, we would generally think that in order to be a cup, it has to be made of matter. But you're talking about a necessarily existing cup, which includes its existence in a possible world where there's no matter. So you've got a kind of spaceless, formless cup.
The very fact that I defined it as a necessarily existing cup would, if we can go with this reasoning, would show that no, there isn't a possible world where there is no matter.
Okay, but yeah, you could construct an argument like that as well.
And also, we don't have to focus on cups, we can talk about different kinds of deities. Or something like that. Like we could talk about one Hindu god, the Neoplatonic one.
It's a little confusing talking about different monotheistic gods because they're kind of the same god, just understood differently.
We could specify, I know there's a distinction between sense and referent, right? But we could actually specify that we're just talking about the thing that exactly satisfies this description. Because you're guaranteeing it's going to be something.
And just describing disparate existence.
Well, in any case, we've probably gone a long while for modal ontological
We're kind of
what tier are we talking?
I
mean, it depends whether or not we're including symmetry breakers.
Yeah.
If we're not, then I'd say it goes really low.
So we haven't really
This level
talked
is
about
cool,
the
but so
different symmetry
high.
breakers that are on offer, but it
I
does seem the
return
case
to
that when you
it.
first hear the modal ontological argument, I remember thinking like, wow, that's really clever. I can't remember when it was, years and years ago, but I remember thinking like, wow, that's really cool. And then somebody presents the reverse, and you're like, oh, well, I have no idea. So I'm exactly where I started, no idea which take. So based on that, I think it would potentially be something like D or E tier. But then it's worth bearing in mind that Plantinga didn't want the argument to be an attempt to establish God's existence to a non-believer. He just wanted to say that if you do believe in God, here's a way to give yourself a rational grounding. Because if you already believe in God, then
Are you
do accept
fucking
the
for
premise that it's
real?
possible that God exists? Yes, you do. From which it follows that God exists. So in other words, it allows you to defend a weaker claim. Now you don't have to defend this claim, God exists. You just have to defend a weaker claim, that it's possible that God exists. So for that purpose of making life a little bit easier for someone who's already a theist, it kind of does a pretty good job. But if we're talking about arguments for God, and I think it's fair to say that most people will assume in this context, we're talking about arguments which establish God's existence to somebody who doesn't already believe in God.
Or give someone a reason. Like even if Plantinga himself didn't try to develop this, Plantinga himself says in his book that this is not a demonstration of God's
What?
existence. This doesn't really give, this isn't a good reason for the atheist.
Make
let's say.
something fucking
So
hard.
maybe it should go into the E tier.
Yeah.
Of course, there are attempts at symmetry breakers.
Which let's not include those, because if we did, I'd bump it up way farther, because some of the symmetry breakers are really interesting. And we discussed one on counter-current, so.
Oh, great. In the conversation that you
Waste
had
of time.
with Cameron.
It was you and me. We discussed
Oh,
my
our
explanatory.
conversation.
Yes.
Yeah. So I almost forgot that Joe and I had a whole conversation on ontological arguments before on Capturing Christianity. We'll put the link there
Not really
as well,
God's
but okay.
ban. Well, God
Some,
actually sucks and does not exist, so maybe.
explanatory symmetry breakers.
And other sorts of symmetry breakers. We'll put it
We'll put it in E tier. But don't you think they need to be considered because they do exist? Like there are
No,
symmetry
this is
breakers.
It's almost like those are different arguments. They're like coming in to supplement.
Fuck.
And once you notice the S5, it's like you supplement it with a different argument.
I see.
almost.
So the argument.
It just depends on your categorization.
The argument on its own is just a bit terrible because firstly it doesn't
This is
establish
not
God's
what I
existence as something he says himself, and also there's a reverse argument which seems at least given just the argument equally plausible. We'll stick it in E.
Yeah.
Okay. Plantinga's modal ontological argument. E tier.
Yeah.
Okay, next we're going to talk about the fine-tuning argument. This is a whole universe unto itself. It's in a whole different category of arguments from what we've discussed so far. We've done cosmological and ontological arguments. This is a
That's a
teleological
level.
argument. It seeks to establish God's existence
But
through
it's
an
not what I need.
observation of the world around us. What is the fine-tuning argument?
Yeah, so there are different versions of the fine-tuning argument. There's one popular presentation by Craig where he just says the various constants of the initial conditions of the universe and the various constants of the universe, the laws of physics, they have certain parameters in there where they have to be in a very, very narrow range, like a sliver, super small sliver, like, and they give these numbers like 10 to the power of negative 44 or something like that. But they have to be in a very narrow range in order to support the existence of embodied conscious creatures like you and me and so on. Indeed, even for life to exist. For instance, the cosmological constant, right? If you increase the size of it just ever so slightly, the universe would like collapse back down on itself. And if you decrease the size ever so slightly, things would extend way too far apart
No,
that the
copyrighted.
closest two different particles are like light
Not
years
getting
apart.
Yeah,
copyrighted.
atoms couldn't
Even form. So in neither of those cases do you get anything like life. And so you get nothing like conscious creatures, conscious embodied moral creatures like you and me. And so what it tells us is that it's extremely improbable just by chance that you'd be able to get a universe where that supports life and conscious creatures and so on. By contrast, if you have a designer hypothesis, that's not at all improbable, right? God sees the value in creatures like this, and so God would be able to fine-tune the constant, or a designer at least.
And
would be able to
the
fine-tune.
intricacy seems to point
The intricacy,
to a
is-
designer.
the very fact that it would be so overwhelmingly improbable by chance seems to give us a reason to think that there's
So-
someone actually tinkering, actually fine-tuning it.
to be clear here, we're talking about the constants of the universe, by which we mean things like the expansion rate of the universe,
Yeah,
the strength of gravity, the strength of the stronger nuclear forces, these kinds of things, the amount of force that they have. So
Also distribution of like matter, antimatter in the early universe.
Right,
Yeah,
intro.
low entropy state. Things like that.
So, taking a simple example like gravity, we're saying that
This is cool, but
the thing under discussion here is the strength of gravity. It's something about like the value. That is, if gravity were stronger than it actually is, then as the universe were expanding, there'd be too much gravity and it would pull it back together again. If gravity were any weaker, then the universe would be expanding too fast.
Yeah.
There'd be
Fuck
nothing to
you.
pull it, to restrict it. It would be expanding so fast that everything would get ripped to shreds. And the argument is that the strength of this thing, the strength of something like gravity, has to be very precise. It's only a tiny bit bigger or smaller. But it's not just that, but like each individual constant on their own are very finely tuned. But you need to have all of these constants all very finely tuned. If any one of them were to change ever so slightly, then life couldn't exist. Now, some people have said, oh, well, maybe life would just exist in a different form. Maybe we'd have non-carbon-based life or something that doesn't require water. But this version of the fine-tuning argument is saying that like atoms themselves.
Yeah, I mean the closest particles would be light years away.
Yeah, like there's no way that anything resembling anything like we are aware of could exist. We're not talking about a world where, you know, planets are kind of ovals instead of, I mean, they are kind of ovals already, but you know what I mean. We're not talking about a universe in which, well, planets are just squares instead of circles. Like, matter doesn't form if these constants are even so slightly changed. And so, given the fact that they're not slightly changed, but they're
except
all
for the
very
intro,
precisely
this
tuned,
might be fun.
doesn't this give us an indication that somebody has done the tuning? Because as you say, by chance, there's nothing logically preventing any of these constants from being any value. And so, in theory, they could be any value. So why are they this particular value? Well, it can't be chance, because the chances are tiny. So design?
Yeah, there are so many
Yeah,
different
go fuck
ways that
yourself.
people have tried to respond to this, and it's
Liar.
actually, it's difficult to really wrap your mind around because the literature is so vast here. But one response that some people give is a multiverse response. Right? So if you have a multiverse, let's say a bunch of different
Why
universes,
do you need this
different
fucking
conditions,
speed changer?
and so on, given that you have a sufficiently vast number of these and a bunch of different permutations of the initial conditions and so on, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to get life to arise in some of these. And in that
That's
case,
real.
it's not very surprising. It's just by chance that you get it because you have so many different trials.
I almost died.
That's one response.
What
that
is
some people try to
that?
give. Another response that some people try to give
Structure.
is that we have to ask, how expected is this data of fine-tuning
Okay,
under
I
naturalism
understand.
or something like atheism, and how expected is it under
Where's state
theism?
level?
Now, just the claim that God exists or there is a designer doesn't really lead us to expect that the value of the cosmological constant would be like 6 point, I don't know, like 6.4384, you know, that, like that's, what? How do you get there? So there's actually a question, how do you get there from just design? It's actually not clear that the design hypothesis predicts the data significantly better than a non-design, a relevant non-design alternative. Now, of course, you can kind of fix that. Like, oh, well, God desired to bring this thing about. So you're building in stuff into your theory. You're kind of front-loading the theory, how you hypothesis, to be able to predict the data. You're saying, well, God desired it to be that value, or God desired to bring about such complex creatures, and so on. Once you do that, it seems as though the naturalist or the atheist could likewise front-load their theory in some sort of way, but also predict the data. They could posit, this is what House has, for instance, he has this stalking objection. The naturalist could equally well posit, let's say, some sort of disposition or some mysterious disposition on the part of the foundation of natural reality to give rise, let's say, to conscious creatures, or to set the values at precisely those, or set the constants at precisely those values. So if the theist is able to front-load their theory by building in a desire to get around this problem that theism by itself, the hypothesis, doesn't predict the data.
Surely you couldn't have a natural world that from its very initial conditions desires to bring about conscious life in the same way that a god can. Because suppose we're trialing just two hypotheses here. One is atheism, one is, let's say, something like Christianity. That is, a god who does love human beings and wants to bring them into existence in order to love them.
What?
The fact that you've got constants that are tuned for the bringing about of conscious life seems to be much more expected on let's say, a loving god than atheism at the very least, right?
It probably just depends on the hypothesis in question. I mean, how are we fleshing out this Christianity? Like, are you building in these desires into your hypothesis? Because by itself, just the mere fact that theism is true, that there's this God, who's omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and necessarily existing, that doesn't really get you to expect that there would be embodied conscious moral patience like us. I mean, there's nothing in that hypothesis that entails that, firstly.
What, within a loving God, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, God would be perfectly self-sufficient in himself. He wouldn't have to create anything like that.
Love is something that requires multiple agents.
Does it, though?
Well, I think, at least plausibly, it could be said to do, right? Like, I mean,
God could have refrained from creating, couldn't he have?
well, that's a difficult theological question. I mean, I think we'd have to say yes.
But God would still be loving himself.
It's difficult. Well, he might be loving because he's part of a trinity, for example. This is one idea. This is Richard Swinburne defends the trinity on the basis of love, right? So it's the idea that because God is loving and because love requires multiple agents interacting with each other, you get something like trinity. I can't even begin to describe how terrible I think that argument is.
Yes, I know, I agree.
But there's something to this idea that in order to love, you need someone to love and to love you back. So, you know, disregarding the Trinity or something, let's imagine like a God of Tawhid, and we say this God wants to love conscious creatures and have a relationship with conscious creatures, then of course it would make sense for him to fine-tune the constants to bring about conscious creatures. Of course it would.
Because you're building into your concept of love that he loves conscious creatures. I mean, you could equally just say on the naturalistic foundation there's some sort of disposition. And it's a non-conscious disposition, but a disposition to produce conscious creatures.
This would be something like
So
the approach
of
of necessity.
existence and God
Because we have three options here, right? We have
which
what explains the constants of the universe. It's either
I don't know.
chance, or it's necessity, they just somehow had to be the way that they are, or it's design. And you're saying, well, maybe there's something about the universe which just predisposes the universe to have these constants.
Or I'm giving that as one response someone could take.
This is just like saying necessity. This is just like saying, well, they're this way because they kind of have to be in some way. There's something about the nature of the universe which makes these constants have to be the way that they are.
Only because that's what you're building into the concept of love in your response.
But there seems to be, okay, because somebody might say, well, there's nothing, it's logically possible that the universe could have all kinds of different constants, and you might want to say it's logically possible that God could be loving and not bring about conscious creatures. It's an interesting concept. It's actually one that I haven't heard of. I guess we could reframe the argument and say that the three potential explanations, something like chance, necessity, or desire.
this level is such a gem.
Disposition. And what you
Or
would
gem,
say is that
or gem.
the kind of disposition
gem, I
slash
think.
desire slash design, words like this
Jewelry,
that might be found in a creator.
precious stone, you know.
Could also be somehow found in the universe.
I mean, I'm just
Well-
giving Malpass's stalking horse objection. And it's not a desire, it's not anything like that. It's just some sort of disposition, part of natural reality. I mean, salt, for instance, is disposed, dissolved in water. You know, that's one of salt's dispositions.
But surely that disposition, you know,
I mean, it's a theoretical concept to explain the basics.
the tendency of like salt to dissolve in water is an example of the kind of physical event or law or constant that we're seeking to explain. So if you say there's something like within the universe or about the universe that explains why the universe is very finely tuned, you've got a bit of a problem with circularity here. Yeah. How can something that exists within the universe or as part of the universe, which itself requires the fine tuning, explain why the fine tuning is or why the concept is so finely tuned? This doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
God sits outside of this structure. And so there's no problem saying God designed the concepts of the universe. So surely we should disallow it.
Well, you could equally say, you could just say that the naturalistic foundation is in some sense metaphysically or
This level is
explanatorily
amazing.
prior to the universe, something like that.
Like
Maybe
really
there's
amazing.
some sort of non-spatiotemporal universal wave function with this relevant causal disposition.
So
I mean,
there's a kind of spaceless, timeless, creative
No.
power with a disposition to bring about conscious creatures. But it's not.
it's
It's
the
not God.
naturalistic.
It's not God.
I mean, this is the naturalistic stalking horse.
So
I'm
this-
not here defending this position.
Aren't you just describing God and calling it a wave function there?
No, because it's not conscious. It doesn't have any loves or desires or anything like that.
This is a physically describable. It has dispositions,
Which
and of course,
are unconscious.
religious language, as Thomas Aquinas would have us believe, is all
No,
an
this
analogy.
one is not
it's
really.
logical. And so, when we talk about God being conscious, we don't mean he's conscious. God is not, according to the Thomistic view, God is not loving. God is not good. God is not powerful, because these words are like human words they're just analogous words to the kind of thing that God is like. And something like conscious is the same. So when you say, yeah, well, this being is unconscious, it just has, what would you call it, like a disposition, that's not quite right, like a desire,
It
that's
is
not
quite right.
Like
Like, disposition is just a
This
causal
is so
power,
bad.
an ability to produce something, basically. You know, it has that
do you understand why
The
somebody
transition.
might kind of laugh at the suggestion that you say that a way to escape the conclusion that God designed the constants
This
is
is
to
me.
say that instead they were kind of designed by a spaceless, timeless, creative
you actually-
entity that has a disposition to bring about conscious beings
Or
in
just to
the
set those
world.
constants in that way, not necessarily with foresight into conscious
Yeah.
creation. I mean, it could be black holes.
Do you
Nearly died.
understand why this is?
Well, first, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, I gave that as an example when you were asking if it's a circularity problem with being in the universe. I mean, you could equally say that it's something within the universe, but it is
Is
let's
it
say at the very
possible?
beginning of time, it's the initial singularity of the universe, and then the constants
be.
come about as a result of that singularity, basically immediately after, or something like that. So it could be in the universe. I gave that as an example just to get around it, or it could be maybe that you've probably heard this parallel monism, where the universe is in some sense tied to its parts. In that sense, the universe as a whole would be able to
What?
explain, be more fundamental than, and explain various features of itself within itself. And so you don't have to go to this kind of spaceless, timeless position.
Alright, this
Again,
is
there are
not
various naturalistic proposals. Again, this
possible
is just a stalking
now.
horse objection. It's to illustrate that it's illustrating how theism by
This
itself
might
doesn't
be.
have the predictive power that many people take it to
Yeah,
have.
this is
You
definitely.
need to build in stuff to your hypothesis. You have to build in the sorts of desires and stuff. You have to build that in order to predict the data, so it seems, or so this kind of line of response says. But once you're allowed to build that in, firstly you're making your hypothesis more complex, but you're just front-loading your hypothesis to be able to predict the data. And the naturalists
But
equally
not
front-load their
maybe
hypothesis
this,
to predict
maybe
the data.
this.
And there are naturalistically friendly, acceptable ways to front-load the hypothesis that don't involve desire, involve some sort of causal disposition. And things have causal dispositions that have nothing to do with desire and so on. Salt or stuff has a causal disposition to melt or whatever, not melt, and dissolve when you put in water, or things like that. So anyway, it's definitely an interesting argument, and I mean, I've only surveyed two different responses, the fine-tuning and then the predictive power problem for theism. There are the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah, you mean multiverse.
Multiverse, excuse me.
Yeah, you said fine-tuning again.
Oh,
Thinking
my
about
bad.
that. So we surveyed two.
Yeah,
the
surveyed two
multiverse.
responses, the multiverse and
Oh,
the predictive
this
power.
is bad.
So there are lots of other responses. Some people challenge the fine-tuning thing. We actually only have epistemic access to universes that share our law structures, and that we just modify the constants and the parameters. But we
This
have no
is
clue
great.
what it would be like if you changed the law structures themselves. So it's actually unclear if
Ah,
the
didn't
universe
want
is
this.
truly fine-tuned for life. But that's three different responses,
Yeah,
I
go
guess.
fuck
So this
yourself,
all
guys.
said, where's it going? Because one final thing that I would say about it is, separate from the kind of actual discussion about the
Want to
viability of the
continue this?
argument, it just moves me the least. I can't
Really?
explain. Now, a lot of people have said the opposite. There's a clip
That's
of
the
Christopher
opposite for me.
Hitchens. There's a clip of Christopher Hitchens saying the same thing. He's asked by Doug Wilson in the back of a car what he thinks, is a good argument for God, and he says that the fine-tuning argument and the constants, and I think he's a bit drunk in the clip actually. So he's kind of he's like, the fact that if they were different by a hair of difference. And he never actually says the point. He never actually says the argument, but he's kind of like, it does, you have to work on it. You have to work on it. He's just saying these kind of vague things, but he's implying that this is something that troubles him.
At some point, certainly, we're all asked, well, which is the best argument you've yet come up against from the other side? And I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one as the most intriguing.
The Goldilocks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Fine-tuning the 1 degree, well, 1 degree, one
this
hair
is cool.
different to nothing. But even though it doesn't prove design, doesn't prove a designer, could all have happened without it. You have to spend time thinking about it, working on it. It's not trivial. We all say that.
For me, I don't know. I think I'm so detached. It feels so kind of sciencey. It's the constants and numbers. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure it's very clever, but something about that realm of discussion. Maybe it's because I'm not a scientist.
Yeah.
It just kind of doesn't sometimes speak to my heart. But you say it's the opposite.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have to be honest, like, it does strike me as a potentially plausible line of argument for theism. I mean, I think it's one of the more powerful ones. I do have worries
say, by the way, I just realised that I didn't even say at the beginning for people who are like my viewers who are familiar with you. Joe's an agnostic.
Yeah, so
an agnostic through and through. Like we didn't even specify that at the beginning. It'd be interesting if anybody's watched this far and didn't know who you were. I'd be really interested to see what they think your view was up until now.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
But you're an agnostic.
Agnostic, which, I mean, for me, what that means, an agnostic is defined differently, but how I kind of articulate it. Basically, just by my lights, the research that I've done and so on, the evidence seems roughly counterbalanced. The weights of reason seem roughly counterbalanced for a theistic view and, let's say, a naturalistic view or an atheistic view. By my lights, they're just roughly counterbalanced by their weights of reason. And so things like some contingent judgments do, by my lights, kind of evidence will shift or fall on one side. Similar with, I mean, I articulate some difficulties in fine-tuning arguments. I go through Nielsen Ababi's paper, Electrons in Love, where he talks about altering the psychophysical law, where actually you could have conscious moral creatures in that universe where there are particles just light years apart. God is omnipotent. He can make psychophysical laws different. Psychophysical laws are laws that connect psychological happenings, mental happenings, with physical happenings. And of course, if you're a theist, you already think that there's a non-physical mind, so this is perfectly fine. Yeah. And so what that means is that even those particles that are light years apart, when they go, like, let's say another light year apart, they could be singing praises to God. When they go another light year apart, they could be in a different mental state where they're in heartfelt love and communication with one another and so on. That might sound science fiction, but for an omnipotent God to be able to do this, just altering the psychophysical laws. Of course, in our kind of universe, with the psychophysical laws that we have, you need complex brain structures to have consciousness. But if you alter the psychophysical laws, you could have completely different. And so God actually would be able to create life. You'd be able to create these good values of conscious moral creatures in universes like that. So Nielsen Ababi talks about that. I go through Neil Manson's paper, where that's actually an attack on theism's predictive power, being able to predict the data, just because, I mean, God's omnipotent, he could do literally anything. And so on. So in my video, the 12-hour video, I go through, and I'm going to break it up, but I go through different responses that people could give. But anyway, it does pull on me. So I would actually, if you're asking me, I'd say A tier. Yeah, but we can, I mean, I'd be flexible.
I think, I will say that although it doesn't move me because it feels a bit detached, as I say, the reason it doesn't move me, I suspect, is because I don't have a firm grasp of the science. But if you ask me to respond to it in a debate, it would probably be the hardest of the arguments.
Yeah.
But maybe that's just because of like my expertise and complete lack of expertise in the area of science. But it seems to be probably the hardest one on the list for me to come up with a convincing response to.
I think that's probably true.
I think it seems to have this effect on all kinds of people, including Christopher Hitchens. And if it upsets Christopher Hitchens, then it upsets me.
Exactly.
With any foe of Hitchens. I can understand it, and I think I'm right now. Fine-tuning in A tier. It's a tricky one.
It's tricky, and that could, I mean, some of the responses could put it down to B, but
I think A is. It depends on the purpose of the argument, because it's supposed to convince. And for me, it just kind of doesn't really do anything. Yeah. I mean, it's like that it's way down low, but as an argument in terms of what to have in your list if you're trying to establish the existence of God for somebody, it seems to be a powerful one. So something about me wants to put it in B tier, because like the Kalam is in B tier, and it seems to me the Kalam is much more powerful to me than the fine-tuning argument.
I mean, it's different. I just prefer that so many different things.
That's true, actually. Maybe the Kalam is just kind of, it does have more responses, it seems more plausible. I mean, yeah, you can respond to fine-tuning arguments for talking about atoms light years apart having relationships with each other. And remember, I mean, it just seems...
What the fuck?
It just seems a bit less plausible.
I mean,
But I won't be able
tells us
to do that
something
downward rate.
Something's going on. Something strange
Oh,
about our universe.
not
Maybe.
this.
Something about the universe is in a way that it could very easily have not been.
At least epistemic.
That seems difficult to explain.
Yeah.
Then okay, sure. You know what? Fine.
A
Fine.
tier
We'll
it is.
take it. A tier.
A tier it is.
Fine-tuning arguments for the existence of God. Tier A.
No, I
Okay.
actually can.
Next, we'll try and rattle through this quickly because we've been going for a long time. The moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. But objective moral values do exist.
This is fucking dumb
Therefore,
as fuck.
God exists.
Proof. Well, one thing you could do is you could just challenge that second premise. No, there are no objective moral values and duties. You could go a subjectivist route. You could say there are moral truths and so on, but the truth of them depends on our stances. Maybe depends on whether or not we want certain things to happen and so on. Or you could just go an error theorist route where you say, no, moral claims like you ought to do this, or that this is good, or that this is really bad. You could say, no, those are uniformly false. You could go a bunch of different routes with that second premise, and philosophers do take those routes. Now, the majority of philosophers actually, as shown by Phil paper surveys, are moral realists, so they would agree with that second premise. So, just setting that aside, that just people can challenge premise
Yeah,
too.
because of course that's like a very easy way. If you just, it's basically saying if there are objective values then God exists. You could just say there are no objective values.
Yeah.
That's one way out of it.
That is one way.
That's the route I would take, for example.
Yeah.
But
I mean, what they're
saying,
going to say is that you're biting a bullet there. You're not able to say, for instance, that torturing someone just because you want to hear them squeal, that's not like really stands independently.
well, why did you say squeal there instead of scream? Are you trying to say something? I mean, I'm trying to think of things that squeal. I don't know why you might say something.
Yeah, I wonder why.
But I'm kind of quite comfortable to do that, to bite that bullet. But I understand why a lot of people wouldn't be. But that's quite like a simple, it's quite straightforward. That's how you get away with the argument. But you say, put that to the side.
Let's just put that aside.
Let's
That's
say
one response people can give.
objective moral values do exist.
Let's grant it. Yeah.
Does it follow that God exists?
It does not, because there are so many different non-theistic alternatives in this branch of philosophy called metaethics, where you're studying the nature and foundations of moral truths and so on. So there are lots of different non-theistic foundations, things where you can ground the truth of moral statements without appealing to God.
But can you? Because I know that there are lots of attempts to do this, but it seems to me, and I would say this as an atheist because I don't believe in objective values, but yeah, I know lots of people claim that objective ethics can exist without God, but I just don't see how it can.
Well, what's God adding? God, whenever he commands something or whenever he says something, he either has some reason for commanding what he does or he doesn't. That's exhaustive. He either has some reason or he doesn't. If he has some reason for commanding what he does, well then it's surely that reason which is undergirding the rightness or wrongness or badness or rightness, the goodness of something, right? If God's commanding you not to rape because there's something wrong about rape in and of itself, maybe because you're violating rights, maybe because of the suffering of the victim, whatever. If God has a reason, it's surely that more fundamental reason.
That would exist outside of God, and
Yeah,
so there would be an objective ethic that exists without God.
Exactly. It's surely that more fundamental reason which is doing the outside heavy lifting with respect to the moral properties
This
of
is
life.
basically the Euthyphro dynamic.
Yeah, it's a version of it. I think it's more powerful. I'm not talking about what makes right actions right, so I'm just talking about whether or not God has a reason for commanding what he does.
And if he has no
And if
reason,
he has no reason, that's arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary. That's what arbitrariness is. You have no reason whatsoever to forbid rape, as opposed to commanding that you got rape. That's just absurd. If you grant that, that's not a moral realism worth wanting. I mean, if that's what you're going to say, I'm really going to come to that. Because that's absurd. That's not the true moral
of
realism.
course, that quite heavily relies on intuition there. Just the
Which
idea that it being arbitrarily objectively true, that these things are wrong, is
What about
somehow
this one?
like troubling.
Yeah, but their argument for the second premise crucially relies on intuition. They're appealing to your intuitions by saying, don't you agree that it doesn't really seem that it's really objectively wrong to torture someone for harm? If you take out that intuition, then you're taking out the justification.
Interesting. That's a good line of good line of defense.
So, I mean, again,
But of course, doesn't this depend on what we kind of mean when we're talking about God's relationship to goodness? Because like there will be views of goodness that say that goodness is just that which is more like God, and there's no reason, there's no rhyme or reason about this. It's just that those things that are more in accordance with God's nature are those things that we call good. We've given it this word good. But again, like as Thomas Aquinas would say, it's not quite right because good is an analogous term. But when we talk about objective morality, what we're talking about is closeness or in similarity or distance from God.
Best.
When you read religious scripture, it often talks about people being distant from God. Their sin distances them from God, as if to say that to be good is just to be more like God. This is perfectly objective.
Yes, but why? What is it about being more like God? I mean, if let's God immaterial, right? Am I better if I'm immaterial? What? That doesn't seem really right. You have to talk about the moral properties of God. If you better resemble God's moral properties, then yeah, you're better. But now you're bringing in the moral properties, like it's the lovingness, it's the goodness and so on. It's that which is good, which is about God, right? It's because you're getting more loving. It's that. It's the loving. It's the kindness. It's the virtue. It's the honesty. That's what's doing the explanatory heavy lifting here, not God. God's acting as an intermediary here. The truly intrinsically valuable things here, that's the virtue. That's the kindness. It's the love.
No, maybe
it's
this is...
the intellectual moral virtue. That's what's
Yeah,
doing the
this
heavy
is
lifting here with respect to explaining why something is good or bad
a
or
good
whatever.
transition.
God's an intermediary. That's fascinating. So, what do you think of a response then instead? We'll try differently, because I think that's a wonderful objection to the objection. What if you say something like, okay, well, goodness, we've got a kind of functional account of goodness. This is a good chair because it fulfills the criterion that the designer had for it, which is for people to sit in it. Now, I could say that this is a good chair and it is at the same time a bad table. But that seems a little bit weird. Like, people don't usually speak like this because they recognize that, of course, I could say that I'm making a table and make this, and then you would call it a bad table. And you could say it works fine as a chair, but it still would be like a kind of bad table because I designed it to be a table. And so we already use language as good and bad in a kind of non-moral sense. That is to say, like, there, like I said it.
That is the fact.
That is to say,
Reading it before you even said that.
that this chair is a good chair because it just fulfills the criterion that its designer has for it. Now, if human beings are designed by a god, and that god has arbitrary desires, even if they're arbitrary, its goodness is just fulfilling the criterion that a designer has for something it creates, that even if it's arbitrary, it is still objectively a good person who fulfills the criterion that the designer created that created thing for. Right? So really this is the goodness and badness of objective ethics, is just doing that which God designed you for.
Okay, now I reject premise 2. Now premise 2 is false because no, I mean, I think you can have objective goodness and badness and so on without defining it as what the designer intended it to be or do or whatever. And again, you're kind of fighting the board almost and saying that it's arbitrary. And like, if God had done this with rape, then it really would have been the case that rape was good.
But presumably, I mean, it's tricky.
Because it's constituted by God's design. Like, there's no antecedent to God's giving his desires. There's no moral facts that he's looking out upon and choosing to design it based on. And so it is just constituted by his choice. And so I really do think this is a quite plausible response. And so if that's, I mean, again, if that's how you're defining goodness, then I reject premise 2. There's no objective moral values and duties in that sense, because that requires origin. In that sense, it's just like stipulatively defined as like what the designer is intending you to do. But I can still have objective star moral goodness and badness, which is a goodness and badness worth wanting, I guess.
One of my favourite ways of responding to this particular approach is talking about functional goodness, people comparing a good person to a good chair or a good table, is to say, again, I think there's an equivocation going on here, because when people talk about moral good, this is actually, I think, the same thing as what you're saying, which is that when people are talking about moral goodness and badness, they're not talking about fulfilling a desire of a creator. That's not what the goodness and badness consists in. The way to see this is to say that, like, if this were designed to be a table, it would be a bad table. It wouldn't be an evil table.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? It wouldn't be an evil table. And yet, if you say that somebody is a bad person, this is usually kind of used interchangeably with evil person. When you're talking about morality, you tend to be talking about goodness and badness in a way that can be translated as virtue or evil or these kind of terms. Whereas functional accounts of goodness, I think, is just an equivocation. So this is a good chair. But what we really mean is it's a functional chair. We don't mean it's a virtuous chair. We don't mean that it's an evil table. That just doesn't even make sense. Right? And so I think that response probably fails as well. So the moral argument, in my view, it just kind of doesn't really have much going for it.
No, I don't think it does either.
How low can we put it though? Because, you know, we haven't put anything in F yet. And the thing is, it does have some intuitive force, at least in the beginning, right? Like lots of people, like when you tell someone you're an atheist, and especially people who've never really thought about questions of God's existence before, one of the first things that they'll say is like, well, like, where do you get your goodness from? Like, and they are suspicious of people who are atheists because they think they have no moral basis, as if to say that there's something intuitively within them that thinks that having objective ethics requires God as a guiding force.
Those who can say
I kind
that.
of have an error theory of sorts with respect to that sort of intuition. I mean, people are just brought up thinking that, like, God is, to use, I think, what is Peter Berger, his phrase, that God is the legitimator of morality. Like, in their mind, he's so intimately tied up with it because they feel enough with this. They can't conceive of there being goodness without God. But that's simply not, that's not because they have some insight into the nature of reality, of the nature of goodness and badness. But it's because they've just grown up associating these things so closely with one another that they find it so overwhelmingly difficult to imagine a worldview in which you sap out God. You're like sapping out the motivational center of their lives. You're sapping out this thing around which their lives are oriented. That's the source of all goodness and beauty and so on. And when you do that, it's almost like they think that, where's the beauty in the world? Where's the goodness? Where's that? I say, the flowers. Look at the flowers. Look at the tree. That's where the beauty is. Look at the suffering of those humans. That's where the badness is. And animals. And yeah, exactly. That's where the badness is. It's not located in this weird extrinsic fact. It's in these situations themselves. So that's why I say, look intrinsic to the world. That's where you see the badness, goodness, beauty, and so on. So I think it's a mistake they're doing. They're almost like confusing legitimating all these concepts by reference to God.
So where do we put it then? Do you think it's like real trash?
No,
When we put it
because
there?
some people have that. I don't really know. The modal everything by itself. It's got to be better than the
You think this is better than
no,
the
I think it's better than power. So maybe we could do it at the E tier.
easier? I would be kind of slightly intuitively prone to taking it higher, and so maybe E is like a good compromise between the two of us.
Okay.
E
that's
tier.
fine.
Okay, if you're happy with that, I think I'm happy with that.
I'm happy with it.
All right, the moral argument for the existence of God is going in tier E. Cool. Now we could talk about the resurrection if you want, or we can end it there. What do you reckon? Do you have much to say on it?
I actually don't have much to say, to be honest.
Do you have a brief, like, if I just asked you straight up which tier you'd put it in?
I think it'd go mid-tier, C, probably.
Really?
F tier, bro.
I mean, C or D. I mean, listen, it's got a really low intrinsic probability, but I do think it has some explanatory payoff. Like, if you accept the
It has
resurrection,
zero
it does explain certain
probability.
data. I mean,
Zero.
it does explain why the apostles, the gospel accounts why the apostles believed as they did despite being persecuted and so on. It explains why we have at least reports of seeing the risen Jesus.
Fake.
So it does explain some data. I mean, there are alternative explanations, like in terms of hallucinations and so on.
Fucking
And those are
lying
intrinsically more probable.
is an explanation.
I don't know, like,
What makes we're just doing it now. We're just doing it.
Okay.
I mean, we're talking the final argument that we wanted to consider that we weren't sure if we were going to consider it or not, but we'll give it some brief mention is an argument for God's existence from the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There appear to be accounts in the Gospel of resurrection appearances, the writings of St. Paul, the earliest sources that we find in the New Testament, which seem to attest to historical facts that a man claimed to be the Son of God, predicted that he was going to die and rise again, was killed, was actually dead, and then was seen by people after he had died, and they believed so strongly that it was the same man that they were willing to be persecuted and put to death for that belief. How do we explain this? Well, because he rose from the dead, and what explains that? That God rose him from the dead. That's the argument that we're just talking about. Now, you said that there are other alternatives, such as like maybe when the disciples saw the risen Christ, they were hallucinating.
or, one of them was hallucinating, and then social contagion effects took on, some of them had certain expectations for it, they almost did agree.
Because of course St. Paul talks about Jesus having risen, having appeared to 500 people at the same time.
Of course, it's one report.
Yeah, it's not very well attested to. But all, three of the Gospels, because the first Gospel doesn't contain any, Mark's Gospel, the earliest Gospel, doesn't contain any post-resurrection appearances.
Those trajectories were fucking something else.
But all of the others report
But
brief
well-
appearances to the disciples on multiple occasions. In the Gospel of John,
So
we
does
have
the...
Jesus
Oh,
appearing
shit.
to the disciples, and Thomas isn't there. And then they go and tell Thomas, he doesn't believe them. So Jesus appears again, and this time Thomas
We should
goes
maybe
up and
repeat
famously
this
touches
from
the
time
wounds
to
and
time. This level's
believes. Like,
cool.
I think that the report of this is a bit mythological. This only story only appears in
It does seem like the Bible. There are aspects of
in the latest gospel. It's also kind of, it seems the most like moralizing. It seems to make sense as a later disciple. But if we were to grant that it was historically accurate for a report, this couldn't be explained by hallucination at any rate. This would be then explained by the gospel being written wrong. But you said that something like people hallucinating has a higher intrinsic probability than that a man rose from the dead. How can you justify?
Fucking obviously.
I mean, people
Fucking
hallucinate all the time.
obviously.
I mean, we know post-bereavement hallucinations are actually somewhat common.
You don't even need fucking hallucinations to explain this. They're just fucking lying.
But
They're lying
the
sacks
problem,
of shit.
The problem is saying that the intrinsic probability of Jesus rising from the dead is so low because of the fact that it's not something that we see happening all the time. That's because it can't happen all the time. Because of course, if God is using this as a vindication of Jesus' divine message, it has to be something spectacular. It has to be something that doesn't happen all the time. If resurrections happened all the time, then it wouldn't be special. And so, can we actually affect the intrinsic probability of this being the case? I mean,
I do think it does.
if God were wanting to vindicate Jesus' message, then it would be more probable that we wouldn't see resurrection happen.
Yes, that's true, but the very fact this never even happens, that we always uniformly see dead people stay dead, gives us reason to think that God doesn't have that yet, right? This is something that Jews, for instance, point out. They point out that, no, like, the very fact that, I mean, well, firstly...
Yeah, imagine person fucking like got back from the dead and nobody fucking cares about religious cocks. There's no more talk about him. Just the religious cocks do that in their gospels.
Christ goes against what a lot of the messianic and so on. But I mean, the very fact that God seems to have a very strong preference not to
Something like that would have been fucking remembered by everyone. Fucking everyone would have known that for sure. If that ever fucking happened.
In fact, almost absolutely every single human of the tens of billions of humans, maybe even up to 100 billion at this point, billions of humans that have ever lived, gives us reason to think that God doesn't, after all, have that desire. Yeah, if he did have the desire, that's what we would... Wait, which desire? The desire to what? Vindicate Jesus' ministry. But the vindication of Jesus' ministry wouldn't consist in raising other people from the dead. It consists in raising specifically Jesus in such a way that is very unusual as a means to vindicate the claims of Jesus. Yeah, but the point is just that, like, the very fact that we see so many people stay dead after they are dead, why are we picking out Jesus in particular? Like, you have to think about the prior probability, or the implicit probability rather, of this hypothesis. Like, why would God pick Jesus, let's say, as opposed to these billions of other people and so on?
Because Jesus is
Jesus.
like, according to the Christian message,
Now you're going to
a little bit special as compared to other human beings. I mean, if the purpose of sending Jesus onto earth in the first place was to have him eventually crucified and then raised in order to die for the sin of man or whatever, then saying, look, you've got this Jesus guy that God's put on earth, why would he have any more reason to raise him than to raise anybody else who died? Well, because anybody else that God could have written would have been a sinner in their lives. And according to Christian theology, we require a sinless person to be killed and then resurrected, and he needs to be God in this one. So of course God couldn't resurrect someone else. But when you say,
This transition
why
fucking
did God
sucks
resurrect
now.
Jesus and not any of the other 100 billion human beings that
It
have ever
doesn't let you
existed?
fucking warm up.
Surely that just doesn't even make sense.
Let's
Of
consider-
course it would be Jesus, because Jesus is the Son of God and he's supposed to be the vindicator of the message.
Well, what's the reason for thinking that he's the son of God? Because he rose from the dead, which is a very question issue. But okay, let's set that aside. That's a good argument. I mean, the difficulty here, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but like, if, let's say we're all tossing coins or something, and someone gets, someone gets 10 heads in a row or something like that, and no one else does. Someone might say, oh, well, you know, God was intending to get 10 heads in a row. And then it's like, and under that hypothesis, how really they'll get it is one. Really good. Super valuable, just like that. But like, why is it you who's getting the 10 as opposed to these other people? Like, why is it 10 heads, not 10 tails, and these other sorts of things? Like, the very fact that, like, this is the sort of thing that's, like, improbable. I'm trying to think of an analogy. Maybe you can help me. But, I mean, my brain is fried.
I think that there's an interesting point in what you were saying. I mean, like imagine the situation which someone flips 10 heads, and he says that it's because God intended him to, and I say, well, I think it's just because you got lucky. And he says, well, why? I say, well, because getting lucky has a higher intrinsic probability than God making somebody flip 10 times. And then he might say, But like the fact that it's so unlikely for this to happen is required because God is seeking to make this a special event, and that would be problematic.
And they're saying, oh,
And
it's
how
special,
the
but
fuck does nobody know about it? Why was nobody fucking talking about it? Except for the religious cocks. Again, if that really happened, do you think... what was the term? Ancient Rome, right? I hope so. Everyone would be fucking believing in Christian God. If that ever fucking happened. They wouldn't try to silence Christianity if that ever happened. Ever.
your reason for thinking it's special is a very.
But I think it might be different with Jesus because Jesus predicted that this would happen to him. He claimed to be the fulfillment of scriptures, which seems to describe the account of resurrection.
Or at least we have later writings which say that Christ did that. I mean, it's unclear whether or not that's... I mean, we have to distinguish between what's our evidence base. Is it reports of X happening or just X happening? A lot of people mistake that.
We also have to distinguish between the objections we're making. So we were considering the hallucination hypothesis and talking about something with probability. You're saying that, well, the reports might be wrong. Now we're kind of talking about a different objection, which is the objection that the scientists didn't hallucinate, but that the stories were kind of...
My point about the reports was when you said, no, Jesus made these certain predictions that came true. That's what I was responding to at that point. I wasn't really going to a different objection. I was responding to your point there, which I was saying, well, those actually might have been... I mean, again, we're trying to come up with global hypotheses that explain the data. And of course, see, the very fact that we're getting into the weeds here and that it's difficult, I think, attests to why this shouldn't be in the F or E or D tier. I mean, maybe it should be C. I think it's about middling because I think there's reasonable disagreement about this sort of thing. For the audience, I'm not like here subscribing to the hallucination hypothesis. I mean, it could be any combination of things that have an intrinsically much more probable than
maybe yes
a resurrection. I mean, it could be socialization, expectation effects, bereavement, post-bereavement hallucinations, and those only have to happen to like one or two other people, and then social contagion effects take on, and other people have certain expectations and other sorts of things, and then later embellishments of the story and so on.
This is bad math.
You don't even have to have group hallucinations. But anyway, my point is just that the very fact that this is so complicated leads me to think that it should be put in the C tier.
Well, I was quite surprised when you said originally, because I don't know, we kind of leant forward, so we might have to cut the video out, but we were discussing whether or not to do the resurrection, and I said, well, you know, at a glance, which tier would you place it in? And you said C tier, and I was like, seriously? Because I just expected that you would place it a lot lower. I mean, myself, I think it's low, but you are right that it.
And this one is just blind.
As Hitchens said, it's fine-tuning. You know, you need to spend time thinking about it. You need to work on it.
Like, this is a serious thing.
Yeah, it seems quite. And also, of course, like the number of reports, the number of like manuscripts for the New Testament that we have that are feasibly close to the source from a kind of secular history point of view.
Yeah, this is what I was looking for.
Unbelievably more numerous than comparative events and reports and stories and writings from similar times and earlier times. So there is like an argument to be made here that makes it stronger than I think putting it in like F tier or. I mean, look, is it a better argument for the existence of God than Anselm's ontological argument?
No one takes... Okay, look, scholars basically uniformly reject Anselm's argument. I mean, Josh Rasmussen, in one of his reviews of their book, he pointed out how the trouble for Anselm's ontological argument is finding out precisely where it goes wrong. Nearly all theists and atheists agree that it goes wrong. So it's like, it's almost dead in the water, I want to say.
But it just seems, you know, I'm looking at the tier list, it just seems so... I don't know, like... You know, should the modal ontological argument be lower than Anselm's? Maybe without symmetry breakers.
Without symmetry breakers.
The moral argument, like, are we really going to say that the resurrection argument is stronger than the modal ontological argument?
Yes.
Not even like from a Christian perspective, but just like from the perspective of somebody who's like just an atheist and has never heard of Christianity, and we say, hey, look, we've got these manuscripts that speak about this guy, and so there's probably this thing called Christianity that's true. But like, just look at the reports here of this man who apparently died and rose from the dead. Look, God must exist.
I mean, it's a probability argument. I mean,
can that be stronger than the
could certainly be stronger than both. I mean, I really think that.
Or like the moral argument.
The moral.
Is that a better argument than the moral argument? Like, I mean, people use the moral argument all the time, but
That's because I had my error theory. That's what they're confused.
yeah, but that's the case, isn't it? I mean, because intuitively you want to say that the moral argument is more
Something
used.
weird happened. I don't know, and I'm not saying like a resurrection happened, but like something maybe like post-breeding hallucinations. Like we know Jesus existed. That's
Something weird happened, as you
we
said.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah, something weird happened, and the very fact that there's reasonable disagreement here. I mean,
Because even if a bunch of people hallucinated,
Yeah.
that's weird. It's
or I
weird
mean,
that
even
that
one
happened.
person and the social contagion effects. I mean, we know that these sorts of things happen, and I think it's really. I'm not going to say obvious. I think it's really plausible that has a greater intrinsic probability than resurrection.
In some of the earliest Gospels, some people have tried to date them to quite close to the life of
I
Christ.
think we have creeds really close to the life of
Yeah,
Christ.
so like in the letters of St. Paul. And so, you know, it could be that somebody just kind of made all this up, that something was written down by mistake, but then it seems strange that there were people alive who would have seen Jesus who didn't think to correct the mistake. So, yeah, there are these other hypotheses, but as you say, there's something weird going on.
Yeah.
It'd be weird if somebody just made all this up. It'd be
Yeah.
weird if a bunch of people conspire to lie about this.
Well, and I mean, it's mainstream scholarship. I'm going to
There's
say we know
nothing
that
weird about
Jesus
that.
existed and that Jesus was crucified. Those at least we know happened. Something after death, something happened. We know Christianity exists. We know that a lot of people at least sincerely claim to have witnessed.
In
at
which
least seen.
case, you think, what, C tier?
C or D? I mean, I'd be fine with either of those. Just, I mean, it is so. I mean, we're overlooking the elephant in the room. This is such an intrinsically low probability hypothesis. I mean, by my lights, that these other hypotheses are so much more intrinsically probable than just someone like literally rose from the dead. I mean, you first have to have like
Probably
something
do
like
this
God
without
to be able to do that. I mean, something beyond naturalism, and that in and of itself is a huge ontological commitment. But also, even if you have God in the picture, God evidently has a very strong preference not to resurrect almost every single person. So,
And where is
but
the music?
there is
I still
reasonable
don't like
disagreement
that
here.
particular argument, but like I see what you're getting at. I'm thinking maybe D.
Yeah, I mean, so if I were on my own, I'd put C. If you were C, you put D. You've satisficed to put things in my,
Yeah, like,
I'll
'cause
satisfice here.
I still don't like that Anselm was all the way down there. It feels weird to put them next to each other, but
Good about
we've
that.
kind of dragged them together in a way.
Yeah.
I think D would be best.
Okay,
I think
I'll-
if you're happy
yeah.
to put it in D, then
Yeah, I'll put it in D.
then we'll say that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth as an argument for the existence of God, is tier D. And with that, I think we are finally done.
We are done.
There are, of course, lots of other arguments for the existence of God, but we wanted to just go for some of the more popular, one of the ones that you hear discussed.
And there are lots of other considerations and objections to the arguments that we considered, and responses and counter-responses and so on, which is just all the more reason to look into your channel, my channel, and so on, because I go into lots of detail.
And so this is where our little journey into philosophical exploration shall end. Thank you, Joe Schmidt, for coming on the podcast. As I said earlier, do check out his channel. I'll leave a link in the description. Watch that 12-hour video. I mean, if any of you actually managed to watch the whole thing in its entirety, then, you know, send us an email or something.
I
because
managed
I'm
to
sure
listen
we can
to it.
reward you in some way or another. I'd just be... Do you think... Has anybody said that they've watched it all the way
What?
through yet?
So my patrons, yeah. I give it to patrons early, and some of them
The
finish.
whole thing?
It takes over a few days. I mean, they watch
Oh
maybe
my
an
God.
hour a day, and that's like a 30-minute commute to their
Sure.
their school or whatever, and 30-minute commute.
It's about the length of like a short audio book, really, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it
Close up
is.
So it's something that can be...
And I'm going to break it up into cosmological arguments. That's only like an hour and a half.
Something.
only. Well, yeah, so
Which
check
I
it out.
don't
There's lots of
have.
wonderful content, even just in that one video, let alone on the whole of Joe's channel. So make sure you check it out. But with that said, I want to remind you that all of the work that I do is supported, like Joe's, it seems, on Patreon. So if you like the work that I do and want to consider
this is-
helping it to grow, please do consider
I
becoming a
know what
patron
this
at
is.
patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic, so we can keep increasing the size and quality of the videos. Of course, this video has been filmed on location in Houston, and so it's got a slightly different stylistic effect. But of course, you are helping me, my patrons I mean, to fund those kinds of trips as well, to be able to justify going around the world and talking to lots of interesting people in person. So thanks as always, especially to my top tier patrons for making this possible. But I think that's everything. So I have, as always, been Alex O'Connor. Today I've been in conversation with Joe Schmidt, and you've been listening to the Cosmic Skeptic podcast.
So, fuck. The transitions are a bit too long. That's what I'm gonna say. But I should beat that one.
Picture me, if you...
I actually never listened to Ben Shapiro, but since he's a right-winger, he's probably a bad person and a stupid person.
You will, at my desk,
If I might call him a person.
scripting the very video that you're about to watch when I see that my friend, colleague,
Probably just
genetically
another
modified
human
skeptic
pig.
has just uploaded a response to the same video as me. I promise I'm not just copying you, Drew, at least not this time anyway. And I have checked to make sure that I'm not stepping on your toes with this video, but of course, a link to GM Skeptic's
Why does it
video
have to
is in
be
the description, and I would
so
recommend
that you
watch
don't
it.
click with both, or what? Or
Ben
is it just
Shapiro,
for fun?
perhaps at least once the de facto commander-in-chief on the conservative front lines of the culture wars, is a man that you may recognise from such classics as encouraging people who own homes about to be flooded by rising sea levels to simply sell them.
Let's say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by, say, 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all these low-lying areas on the coast underwater. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
To Fish, presumably, who once accused the chairman of The Spectator of being a, quote, lefty, before leaving the interview early in protest of this well-known conservative journalist's left-wing bias.
Why don't you just say that you're on the left? Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest?
And of course, his, shall we say, confusion over what Cardi B was trying to get across by rapping about her wet cast keyword.
There's something that is going on here that is not biologically normal. And by the way, the song is so unsexy that it frankly sounds like somebody describing what amounts to a serious condition that requires the care of a doctor.
Indeed, for people like Ben, the only person that you should ever be getting on your knees for is a more supernatural kind of daddy. And in fact, he appears to believe that anybody who fails to recognize the existence of some supernatural creator of the universe is suffering from a moral and intellectual shortcoming. Ben recently released, as
What
part
projection?
of his Debunked series, a video called The Atheist Delusion, an ironic reference, of course, to Richard Dawkins' famous book of 2006. How original. So, let's take a look at why Ben thinks that if you, as I, don't believe in God, you've got some intellectual work ahead of you.
Listen, there's no way to blame people who don't believe in God because they've experienced enormous amounts of personal pain. God
Suck my
is apart from
again.
human beings, and if we understood the mind of God, then we would be like God in his totality, which we are not. That does not mean that you're not feeling the pain
He
that you're
speaks
feeling. It doesn't mean
disgustingly.
You don't have a right to feel angry at God. But understand that the struggle with God is a part of religion itself. Being a religious believer is the consistent struggle with the logic of the universe. And that seems to me a deeper and more fulfilling struggle than simply pretending the universe has no meaning.
Being a religious believer is the consistent
Exactly.
struggle with the logic of the universe. And that seems to Ben, quote, a more fulfilling struggle than simply
my
pretending that the universe
God.
has no meaning at all. Why would being a religious believer be a, quote, struggle with the logic of the universe? As if the logic of the universe doesn't naturally point to God, and this
Yes.
is instead something we have to effort to make consistent with our observations of the universe. How much suffering it contains, how absent God constantly appears to be from it. Ben has already done some of the work for the atheist in pointing out that being religious is a struggle. And not just because of the social implications or whatever, but because of the very, quote, logic of the universe, the struggle against which Ben says is integral to religious belief. But also consider that Ben said he finds this a, quote, deeper and more fulfilling struggle than simply pretending the universe has no meaning at all. It may well be deeper and more meaningful or fulfilling to you, Ben,
Alright.
but that of course works in
play that
favour of the atheist too. It implies that at least part of the reason why you choose theism over atheism is not because of reason or argument, but simply because you find it more meaningful and deeper. Of course, this is
What is
exactly what
this?
the atheist thinks accounts
Is
for
it
religious
just
belief in the
circles?
first place. man's desperate effort to invent purpose and meaning where it doesn't exist, to make themselves feel better about being stuck in the human condition. Thanks for admitting it, I guess. Ben then assumes that atheism and nihilism are the same thing by saying that the opposite of being a religious believer is asserting that the universe has no meaning at all. Now, it may well be a defensible position that atheism should entail nihilism, but Ben's sort of smuggled in the meaninglessness there by conflating the two as if they're the same thing. But don't worry, because bizarrely, Ben also implies that nihilists are only pretending to be nihilists. For him, struggling with the logic of the universe, whatever that even means, is better than, quote, pretending that the universe has no meaning.
Simply pretending the universe has no meaning.
This suggests, of course, that a person who doesn't adopt theism is merely pretending to be an atheist or a nihilist. And it smacks of a patronizing, I know that deep down you do actually believe in God, while suggesting that atheists, like myself, are somehow pretending, or at least engaging in self-denial. Think about it, how offensive would it be if I said, atheism is just the result of struggling with the logic of the
I would say so.
universe, which is far more deep and meaningful than simply pretending that God exists.
Yeah.
Not only would that...
I would actually say that. I would say to any theist, almost any actually, that they're just pretending they believe in God. They have... Most theists don't have even one, let's say, personal experience with God. It or he or whatever never talked to them, never helped them in any meaningful way that they would be able to address it or follow it back to divine intervention or whatever. Yeah, most just say that they do and wear a cross on their neck. That's all they do.
Misrepresent your position, Ben, but it would also suggest that you're lying, at least to yourself and potentially to others, by only pretending to believe what you claim to believe. Is that what you're trying to accuse atheists of doing?
God, according to atheists, is an unnecessary hypothesis. The universe just is. We just are. There's no reason to search for a creator.
Of course there's reason to search for a creator. I mean, Ben, I'm essentially a professional atheist at this point, and my entire career has been an exercise in searching for a creator of the universe. An atheist is simply a person who is yet to find such a being, not someone who thinks that it's not worth searching. Indeed, many atheists are atheists precisely because they started searching for the God that they've been told penetrates the entire universe and found absolute radio silence in response to their prayers, and hardly any persuasive force in the arguments used to support his existence.
There's no reason to search for a creator, to posit that he bears balance,
I'm
to
not
suggest
yet
that there's
ready
some
for this.
higher power that bridges the gap
When
from
will
what
I finally
is
be
to how
ready?
things ought to be.
Trying to
What
ground
is
ethics
this?
in descriptive, scientific facts about the universe,
What
or
is
getting
this?
an ought from an is famously one of the greatest challenges of philosophy. Ben's correct that this is an extremely difficult thing to do on atheism, perhaps even impossible. But why would believing in God make the problem any easier? David Hume is famously credited as a popularizer of the is-ought problem. He points out that to say something like, it is the case that racism causes suffering, therefore we ought not be racists, is an invalid inference. It doesn't follow. You can't derive an ought from an is alone. You need an extra premise, something like, we ought
No, theists can do that very fucking easily.
not cause suffering. Now the argument is valid, but as you can see, we're not getting an ought from an is anymore, but just an ought from another ought. So no matter how many facts we have about the way the universe is, we'll never be able to derive how we ought to behave. Now, Ben is suggesting that God can somehow solve this problem and allow us to derive an ought from an is. But why? Suppose we say something like, it is the case that God forbids murder, therefore we ought not murder. This too is invalid. We can't derive an ought from an is. So we need to inject an extra premise, like, we ought not do what God forbids. Now the argument's valid, but again, we're just getting an ought from
Oh, I
an
wonder
ought,
if that's
still not an
possible.
ought from an is. you'll never be able to justify these extra ought premises by using is premises alone, even if the is premises are about God. You always have to assume an ought from the outset. Now, if I'm not allowed to do that with something like avoiding suffering, then why should you be allowed to do it with something like following God's commands?
Atheism often claims that religion corrupts mankind.
If you want to make good people do wicked things, you'll need religion.
That the notion of a God blinds men to the truths around them. That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
You give them an A at least for trying to reconcile faith and reason. I don't think they're reconcilable.
None of these things are true.
That was a little bit unfair. You used that clip of Neil deGrasse Tyson to make it seem like he was saying that, quote, science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
But if you watch the full interview, Neil is clearly saying that science
On my
is
keyboard,
opposed
this is a
specifically
bit
to biblical
difficult, but
fundamentalism.
possible, I
Things
believe.
like believing that the earth was created in 6 days. Not that it's opposed to belief in God generally. In fact, he specifically says that it's perfectly possible to be a religious believer whilst accepting the findings of modern science, and that it's the fundamentalists with whom science has a problem.
And so the educated religious people are perfectly fine with that. It's the fundamentalists who want to say that the Bible is the literal truth of God, and want to see the Bible as a science textbook, who are knocking on the science doors of the schools.
I respect those more, to be honest, and not because they will die off quicker. No, not because of that. Because you either decide to be fucking logical and thus not be Christian, or you decide to be completely delusional and believe completely without evidence, just like Jesus told people to do. I kind of like black and white thinking, you know? So I have much more respect for those who believe like everything they're told than those who believe selectively. That is pathetic.
The religious people are not behaving that way. They're saying, yes, science is cool, we're good with that.
Now listen again to what Ben implied Neil was trying to argue.
That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
Which I hope you can see is not what Neil was saying at all.
Let's begin with the idea that God is an unnecessary hypothesis. It's
What
difficult
is
to
the
imagine
smallest
an
click I
argument
can
in which
do?
God is utterly unnecessary. That is because all human logic is rooted in certain basic assumptions about the nature of the world and about reason that are completely unmoored from the dictates of evolutionary biology. First, we make claims of objective truth that exists independent of human minds. How does such truth exist? Based on the dictates of evolutionary biology, our ability to comprehend truth should really be no more than our ability to think whatever is most evolutionarily beneficial for us and our genetic descendants. But we don't believe that we think 2 plus 2 equals 4 because it's evolutionarily beneficial. We believe 2 plus 2 equals 4 always and everywhere.
No.
It's true. And that bespeaks a truth beyond the merely material.
Ben's just presented an argument attributed to Alvin Plantinga called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. If there is no God and human beings simply evolved blindly by natural selection, then how can we trust our very ability to reason, to add 2 and 2 and get 4? Think about it. What does natural selection...
Can you fucking take 2 apples, then take 2 more and get fucking 5? Do you need fucking God to tell you it's 4? Oh my god.
Select for? Well, it selects for survivability. It doesn't select for truth. Now, of course, it could just coincidentally be the case that whatever's beneficial for our survival to believe also just happens to be true, but this seems incredibly unlikely, at least considering how many true things we claim to know and how much room there is for such a process of reasoning to go wrong. Now, if we are entirely evolved creatures, then our reasoning faculty is evolved too, which means that our reasoning faculty evolved not to tell us what's true,
possible on
but
my
to tell us
device.
things that make us more likely to survive. So
without
when my
rapid
reasoning
trigger
tells me 2 plus 2 is
being
4,
alt
how can I know
cursor
that this
keyboard.
is true and not simply beneficial
is
to
this?
believe for my survival? Well, if we're atheists who believe that we evolved by natural selection, we can't know this at all. But of course, if there's some kind of intelligent creator overseeing our evolution, then he can design the process such that it does result in our reasoning faculties being accurate to truth, meaning that we can trust our reason. So, the argument goes, the only way that we can trust our very ability to reason is to assume that our minds were purposefully designed by a creator. For what it's worth, I think this is a wonderful argument, characteristic of Transcender's genius. Truly it deserves a video of its own, and it may well get one. But what I'll say here is this. What kind of video are we watching right now? We're watching
Indoctrination
Ben's
video.
provide a number of reasonable arguments that God exists, and that atheism is
Zero
false.
reasonable
He's about to go
arguments.
on to provide a number
Not a
of
single
other
one.
reasonable arguments throughout the video. But he begins by saying that our very ability to trust reason in the first place must assume God's existence. Without God, we can't trust our reasoning faculty as sensitive to truth at all. But can't you see how this completely undermines the rest of the entire video and condemns it to be circular? Indeed, saying that we have to assume God's existence to trust reason makes all philosophy of religion completely circular. Why do I say this? Well, suppose we want to make an argument for God's existence. These arguments are supposed to show us that we can use reason to establish God's existence, and this is what the rest of Ben's video is dedicated to trying to do. The problem is that if we're going to use reason to establish God's existence, then we of course need to trust our reasoning faculties in order to make the argument work. But Ben's just told us that in order to trust reason, we need to assume God's existence. So before we can even use reason to argue for God's existence, we need to assume that God exists. But as you can see, this makes any attempt to prove
Animal
God's existence
pattern.
using reason
Anda.
entirely circular, because we need to begin with the very
No, I don't think
conclusion
it's
that we're
possible.
seeking to establish. But the rest of Ben's
Maybe it
video
is.
consists in him using reason to argue for God's existence. So by saying that we need to assume God in order to use reason in the first place,
No, that's not.
Ben is seemingly unknowingly begging the question, making literally any other of his arguments
meow
entirely
paw.
circular.
Second, we make claims with regard to
Alright.
morality. But what is morality without a baseline assumption that human beings have inherent worth? Even utilitarian philosophies, the attempt to ignore moral right and wrong in favor of consequentialist outcomes, the greatest good for the greatest number, for example, has to assume something about what makes an outcome
That's-
good or bad.
The needs of the many,
This is basically nothing.
the needs of the few.
You can't determine the greatest good for the greatest number without determining the greatest good. And that has moral premises
can.
that have to be assumed. The belief in any moral ought require us to believe unprovable truths that must descend from outside ourselves.
So we already just covered the is-ought problem a moment ago, but here we have a more detailed moral argument for God's existence. Ben says that most of us assume that certain things are right and wrong, and that morality exists. But, he asks,
What is morality without a baseline assumption that human beings have inherent worth?
though I do wish that he'd included non-human animals as having worth too, Ben's right. In order to have morality, we need to have at least one basic moral assumption. Remember, if all we have is non-moral facts about the universe, just a bunch of is statements, we'll never be able to get an ought. So Ben correctly states that morality has to assume some moral premise, such as that we ought respect the worth of human beings. As long as we assume this, we can start deriving moral facts. But the problem is grounding that moral assumption. Why is it that human beings have inherent worth? Notice that Ben didn't provide an answer to this at all, let alone proving that it can only be grounded in God. Opting instead to rather mystically say,
The belief in any moral oughts require us to believe unprovable truths
Anda.
that must descend from outside ourselves.
if the
How's
moral
it
truths
different?
are unprovable, then how can you know that
It's
they must be
there.
grounded in God? You're suggesting on the one hand that our basic moral assumptions can't be proven, but on the other that they can be vindicated by God's existence. Why? If God commanding something proves that it's moral, then these aren't unprovable truths at all. But you say that they are unprovable, and that they must, quote, descend from outside of ourselves. once again providing absolutely no proof of this, and in fact stating that such a statement can't be proven. If not, then how the hell do you know that this is the case? I recently recorded a podcast with Joe Schmidt in which we went into some more detail on the moral argument and whether introducing God into the picture actually helps us ground ethics at all. So if you're interested in some more detail on this, you can watch that, and I'll put a link in the description.
Third, we live as though we believe in choice, as though we are capable of making decisions in some way based on our own will. What in materialism would allow for such a choice? How would such choice come about? If we're just balls of meat wandering around in space, how exactly do we make choices?
This is so fucking dumb. This is so fucking dumb. Yeah, this is exactly as bad as I expected from a right-wing influencer. This is exactly what I expected. Fucking anti-intellectualism. Like, just be completely fucking dumb, ignorant, and yeah, and hateful and exclusive and racist and all that.
God is necessary for these thoughts, or at least the possibility of God. Trash God altogether, and you can't explain why you would believe in objective truth, or morality, or even your own ability to choose.
I'm beginning to see a trend here. Once again, Ben has detailed one of the great problems of philosophy, and correctly pointed out that it's very difficult to solve if you're an atheist. But failed to see that the problem is equally difficult to solve if you're a theist. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I don't believe that free will exists, precisely for at least some of the reasons that Ben has just pointed out. But Ben just simply says, that's why we need God to solve the problem.
How exactly do we make choices? God is necessary for these thoughts.
Without providing a single reason why the existence of God would make the existence of free will any more plausible. If God existed, we'd still be big bags of meat wandering around in a universe that's either determined or contains some randomness, both of which by definition we have no control over. Now you might say that if God exists, then we could have a soul, and maybe free will somehow exists in there. But you can believe in a soul and still be an atheist, and even if we have a soul and the soul determines our actions, we run into the exact same problems as saying that the brain determines our actions. As long as we can't ultimately control what it is that our soul desires, we can't be free. And for more information on why, you can watch my video on free will. I recognize that a lot of you will remain unconvinced, but it's something that requires a little bit more attention. So you can watch my video on free will, and that will explain why I don't believe that it does exist, nor do I believe that it can. So notice the sleight of hand that's going on here. Ben points out an impossible task, such as justifying the existence of free will or getting an ought from an is. He then says, quite correctly, that on atheism, the task is impossible. But it's impossible on theism too. It's as if he said something like, if God doesn't exist, then 2 + 2 can never equal 5. Like, sure, yeah, that's true. But if you're going to imply that God existing would somehow make us able to do this, you have to demonstrate it. And what arguments did Ben give in favour of free will if God exists? None.
As it turns out, there are a bevy of logically consistent arguments offering against God. Take, for example, the first cause proof advanced by Aristotle as refined by Thomas Aquinas. Edward Fazer lays out the argument in his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. The argument goes something like this. First, change exists in the world, but all change is the actualization of the potential for that change. So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing. No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. So that means that all change is caused by something already actual. This means either there is an infinite regress of actualizers, or there is a purely actual actualizer. This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? It's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential.
A fucking prime turtle.
Because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging
Big
cause
Bang,
that's
bro.
purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
Now we're talking. The argument from change is a fascinating argument that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention in modern apologetics. Ben serves his view as well by pointing them to Ed Fazer's book, which spends a marvellous 51 pages on this Aristotelian argument. Ben went over it quite quickly, so let me try to give you a bit more detail. The first premise is usually accepted as common sense. Change exists. Things change. A hot coffee becomes a cold coffee. A parked car becomes a moving car. The most subscribed atheist skeptic YouTube channel becomes the second most subscribed. But skeptic YouTube channel becomes the second most.
Who's that?
Subscribed. But change as a concept is a bit more paradoxical than it may seem at first. Think about it. What is change? Well, according to Parmenides, a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, change is actually impossible. When things appear to change, it can only be that, an appearance, an illusion. In reality, nothing ever actually changes at all. Okay, why on earth would he think this? Well, for change to occur, says Parmenides, there needs to be something that at one point doesn't exist and then comes into existence. Fazer imagines a hot cup of coffee. The cold coffee that it will eventually become doesn't exist yet. It's not there. It's not anywhere. And if something doesn't exist, it's nothing. So for the coffee to become cold, something, that is the cold coffee, must come from what is currently nothing. But Parmenides draws our attention to one of philosophy's most famous observations. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. Or to put it in more familiar terms, you can't get something from nothing. From nothing, nothing can come. And so if change involves something coming from nothing, then change can't actually exist and must be some kind of illusion. Or take an example from the Philosopher, a wonderful channel by the way. My skin is white, but if I sit out in the sun, it will become red. This change in my skin color requires that redness, which currently doesn't exist, comes into existence. What is nothing must become something. But if something coming from nothing is impossible, then change must therefore be impossible too. Pretty weird, right? Well, not according to a small-time thinker from Steigera you may have heard of, called Aristotle, who argues, contrary to Parmenides, that change doesn't involve something coming from nothing, but rather something coming from potential, which is not quite the same thing as nothing. Ed Fazer imagines, once again, the hot coffee. Now, the future coldness of the coffee is not actually present right now, but it is potentially present, in that the hot coffee currently has, right now, the potential to become cold. The parked car has the potential to move forward. My channel has the potential to overtake Drew's once more. Or so I like to think. Now, you may say that this is just wordplay. Sure, the coffee has the potential to become cold, but the coldness still doesn't exist. Well, sure, but consider something else that doesn't exist, like a chicken. This coffee is not cold, and it's also not a chicken. But these seem importantly different, since the coffee seems to have the potential to become cold, but it doesn't have the potential to become a chicken. The coldness and the chicken both don't exist, but the coldness seems to not exist in a different kind of way, a more substantial kind of way, because although it's not actually present, it is potentially present in a way that the chicken is not. So sure, if this hot coffee were to turn into a chicken, that would seem to be like something coming from nothing. But if the hot coffee turns into a cold coffee, it seems to be something coming from potential, which is not quite nothing, at least not in the same way as the chicken is. So, for Aristotle, change is not something coming from nothing, but rather the actualization of potential. Actualization here just means something potential becoming actual. The potentially cold coffee becoming an actually cold coffee. So the reason why this coffee can't change into a chicken is because change is the actualization of potential, and this coffee doesn't have the potential to become a chicken. So potential is a real thing that exists of objects like my coffee that's distinct from nothing at all. At least that's what Aristotle would have it believe. So the first premise of the argument that Ben's presenting is that change exists. And we might have thought from Parmenides' paradox that change can't actually exist. But maybe this paradox fails, because change doesn't actually require something to come from nothing, as Parmenides thought, because potential isn't nothing. It's a real property of my coffee which just needs to be actualized, and that actualization of the real potential that my coffee has to become cold is what we call change. So the argument continues, change requires a changer. Potential doesn't just spontaneously actualize, it has to be actualized by something else. The potential coldness of the coffee is actualized by the coldness of the room. The potential million subscribers on this YouTube channel is actualized by you smashing that subscribe button. And don't forget the notification bell. I also have a Patreon. But crucially, only something that's already actual can actualize something else. The potential coldness of my coffee can't be actualized by, say, a really hot room that has the potential to be cold. The room has to be actually cold in order to actualize the coldness of the coffee. But this is the beginning of a regress. Why? Well, because the coldness of the coffee is actualized by the coldness of the room. But the hot room becoming a cold room is itself the actualization of potential, as is the existence of the room in the first place, since at one point this room never existed, it only potentially existed. And so the room itself required an actualizer, and whatever actualized the room requires its own actualizer, and so on and so forth. Now, if this chain goes on infinitely, we seem to have a problem. As Ben argues,
This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. And what about that one? It's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. A cause can't have any potential. Because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. There's one unchanging cause that's purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other things.
so as you can see, this is a kind of first cause argument that doesn't establish much beyond the existence of some fundamental, purely actual cause at the basis of all other actual things. Now, this might not sound like God yet to you, but a purely actual cause that sustains and actualizes everything that exists. It's pretty difficult to believe in and call yourself an atheist. Okay, that was maybe a bit long, but I hope you're still with me. I think it was worth really spelling out this argument. If any of the previous doesn't make sense, or you're confused about it, you can read Ed Page's book, or simply Google the argument contained for more information. Now I want to tell you some issues that I have with it. The first problem that I have with this is treating potential as if it's a real quality of an object. To avoid thinking of change as something coming from nothing, we imagine that this hot coffee really has this thing, this potential to become cold. Potential is thought of as a real property of my coffee.
So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing.
But consider this. My coffee has the
I got so
potential.
fucking
There's a
scared.
potential for that change in the thing.
But consider this.
This music was
My
in the
coffee
video.
has the potential to be lots of things. In fact, it seems to have the potential to be an infinite number of things. For example, my coffee is currently around 70 degrees Celsius, and it has the potential to cool down to 60 degrees Celsius. It also has the potential to be exactly 60.1 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.11 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.111 degrees, and so on, ad infinitum. Now, a great deal of religious philosophers and non-religious philosophers believe that actual infinites can't exist. For example, this is the basis of William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam cosmological argument. If an infinite number of things really exists, it leads to all kinds of paradoxes, perhaps most famously the paradox of Hilbert's Hotel.
The way in which Ghazali shows the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences from it.
More information is in the description. I'll link my podcast episode with Florian Lane Craig, one of my favourites to date, in which we talk about this in some detail. Now, it's important to distinguish between actual infinites and potential infinites. Actual infinites would be some kind of actually infinite number of things that exist all at once, whereas potential infinites are things which tend towards infinity without ever actually getting there. For example, I can half the space between my hands, and I can half it again, and I can half it again, and I can half it again, and I can keep going on ad infinitum. But because this is a process that tends towards infinity, that never actually gets there, there's no paradoxes involved. Now, if I keep on adding decimal points to the temperature of my coffee, as I did a moment ago, it may seem like we're dealing with a potential infinite that continually tends towards infinity, but never actually gets there. But remember, in order to avoid Parmenides' objection, we needed to say that all of the potential properties of this coffee are potential properties that are real, that it actually has right now. It actually has these properties, these potential properties, because otherwise, if they didn't exist, if they weren't real, they'd be nothing, and then we'd run into Parmenides' objection. But that means all of these potential temperatures that my coffee could be are potentially present in the coffee all at once right now. This isn't something tending towards infinity as I counted out. These things are thought of as actually existing as potential properties of my coffee right now. So if we have to think of a potential property as a real thing in order to avoid something coming from nothing, then we would be positing that this coffee has an actually infinite number of properties which really exist, which seems to be impossible. A second problem is one that was raised by the atheist philosopher Graham Oppy while he was discussing this very argument with Ed Fazer himself, something that you can watch on the Capturing Christianity YouTube channel.
Yeah, this is really
Oppy
wave
simply
spam.
grants that change is the actualization of potential. But he points out that the reverse is not true. Not all actualization of potential is change. He provides the example of a chair, like the chair that
At
I'm
least
sat on
it's
right now.
wave
This
spam.
chair is yellow. This chair has the potential to become blue, say, if somebody were to reupholster it. But it also seems to have the potential to remain yellow. That is, things that are actual seem to have the potential to simply remain as they are. If they don't have this potential, then they wouldn't be able to remain as they are, and so they would stop existing. And therefore, actual things will always have at least one kind of potential,
Come on.
which is the potential to remain as they are. But now listen to what Ben correctly says about the first cause established by the argument from change.
There has to be one prime cause. A cause
Are you for real?
can't have any potential. Because if it had potential,
Is
something
this
else
guy
could
for
activate it
real or
into
not?
changing. So there's one
don't
unchanging
believe
cause
it.
that is purely actual.
The God that Ben is talking about has to be something that has no potential whatsoever. But as I've just argued, unless God is about to stop existing, he must have at least one
This
kind
is
of
really
potential, which is the potential to remain as he is, to remain in existence. So the purely actual God with no potential that Ben thinks is proven may not
This
actually
is
be
just
able to
the
exist
same.
at all. Finally, my third objection is that the argument from change may only work on an A theory of time. The A theory of time posits that the present is all that exists. The past and the future, in other words, don't exist. There's just the present. The B theory of time, on the other hand, posits that the past and the future both exist just like the present does, and that they all exist in one big time block. It can be a little bit weird to get your head around, but on the B theory of time, it's often suggested that objects, as well as having 3 spatial dimensions, also have a 4th temporal dimension that stretches across this time block. Of course, we're only able to see one point of this dimension, but the past cup and the future cup both exist just like the present cup does. The only thing that makes this part of the cup the present cup is that the person calling it the present cup occupies the same place on the time block as this particular part of the cup. So on this view, you are, right now, looking at a different part of the cup than you were a moment ago. Because the cup has a real, unobservable, but real dimension that stretches through time. And what you think of as the present cup and the future cup are actually just different parts of this same cup along that temporal dimension. Thus, the potential cup, the cold cup, and the actual cup, the hot cup, are actually just the same cup. And these words merely describe different points along this temporal dimension. But all of these points exist all in the same way, and if you were able to step outside of the time block, you'd see them all at once. If this is the case, then calling something potential simply because it exists at a different point on the time block to me, and actual when it exists at the same point, would be like me calling the coffee
Oh, no, this
potential
is-
because it was in a different room and house where I can't see it, and actual when it happens to be in front of me. This is a misleading description of what's actually going on. So if the potential coffee and the actual coffee are actually both just different parts of the same coffee that you could see as one big block if you were outside of time,
Cool.
then the distinction between potential and actual is no longer a property of the coffee, but a property of the observer, and which point of the coffee's temporal dimension
Why
they
do
happen
we
to
make
be
such
looking. Now, if this is
levels?
the case, if this is an accurate description of reality, then if we were to look from outside of time, we see that there's no such thing as real
That was
change,
pretty straight in the
because the
end.
past, the present, and the future cut
Good girl.
would all simply exist all at once in front of us on this time block. For what it's worth, Ed Fazer actually discusses this very objection, and specifically the view that Einstein's relativity theory points to a B theory rather than an A theory of time. So there are three objections to Ben's argument to consider. First, the problem of an actually infinite number of potential properties, if
I've been
potential
here.
properties are real things that are predicated of an object. Secondly, the problem of the purely actual actualizer, in fact, at
Was it
least
actually
having
hard?
one
No.
time block, the potential to remain as it is. And thirdly, the problems raised for the argument by adopting a B theory of time, making change itself something of an illusion. It is also worth briefly noting that so far I've basically just agreed to Ben's earlier claim that there just can't be an infinite regress of potential things being actualized.
The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final truth.
I'm inclined to think that it would be really weird if there were such an infinite regress, but Aristotle himself actually took this view. Of course, to believe as he did in an infinite temporal regress requires belief in an infinite past, which has its problems and paradoxes, and Fazer's discussion of an atemporal hierarchical chain of causation seem like they can't actually be infinite for compelling reasons that he discusses in the book. But of course, if there is an infinite regress of actualization of potential, this would count as a
Not
fourth
even
objection
anyway.
to the argument. It's just not one that I would want to defend. Now, as I've already said, I think that the argument
If
for
I do
change
so,
is
this will be
brilliant
fun.
and fascinating
At least
and
remotely.
compelling. Sure, I have objections that I've just spoken about, but these might be easily answered for all I know by a philosopher or someone like Ed Fazer's caliber. But even if my objections can be answered, it seems to me that Ben's suggestion that atheism is a delusion
No.
because of the argument from change in the last point is, shall we say, hyperbolic at best. Now Ben's video gets a bit more scientific, which isn't exactly my area. I really wanted to just talk about the argument from change here as the main part of the video, but I don't want to seem like I'm ignoring anything. So let's briefly watch through the rest of the video, and I'll offer some passing comments, but best refer to a scientist for something more substantial on the following points.
Now, atheists frequently suggest that science has killed God. But as we've seen, science itself requires certain presuppositions outside of science. As mathematician Kurt Gödel stated, any internally consistent system of mathematical axioms cannot be completely comprehensive. There must be assumptions made outside the system.
I'm pretty sure that Gödel's incompleteness theorem just tells us that any axiomatic system, a mathematical system, can never prove every true statement that can be made in that axiomatic language. In other words, it tells us that there might be true statements that, despite being true, are impossible to prove. As Marcus de Sautoy puts it,
At its heart, it says there might be conjectures out there about numbers, for example, something like Goldbach's conjecture, might actually be true. So it might be true that every even number is the sum of 2 primes, but maybe within the axiomatic system we have for mathematics, there isn't a proof of that. The real worry is, what if there's a true statement that I'm working away on which actually doesn't have a proof?
so Gödel's theorem shows us that there will be things described
Come
by our
on.
system that our system can't prove. And so, epistemically, we need to make assumptions outside of the system. But that just tells us about what we can prove, not about the actual nature of the things being proven. As De Sautoy says,
The Gödel showed that actually there's a gap between truth and truth.
but again, this really isn't my area, nor is it Ben. Go and ask a mathematician.
Atheists claim that the evolutionary process relieves the need for God. After all, if God wasn't directing the process of the creation of human beings in the literalistic interpretation of the biblical creation story, who needed God? The problem, of course, is that evolution is an extraordinarily complex process that does not forestall the possibility of a directing hand.
Well, no, evolution itself doesn't disprove God or preclude his existence. But I think it's misleading to suggest that it was ever supposed to.
How much time
Sure,
left?
evolution
Oh, a
causes
bit.
problems for
Let's get
belief
back to
in
Secret
God's
and Circles
existence,
done.
but only in specific ways.
Oh,
For example, it
Yes.
invalidates the argument for God's existence from biological complexity. It also raises questions about why a process involving so much suffering
but I will
was the
need
one used
Nico
by
7.
God, and what could make human beings special if they were all connected on one evolutionary tree. These are interesting problems for theism, caused by evolution by natural selection. Of course, they don't disprove God's existence altogether, but just important considerations against it.
Stephen Meyer, an intelligent design advocate, points out that the transmission of information via cellular processes looks an awful lot like an intelligent creator transmitting information. Our experience of the world shows that what we recognize as information invariably reflects the prior activity of conscious and intelligent persons. What then should we make of the presence of information in living organisms?
Of course, one of the great beauties of evolutionary biology is its ability to explain exactly why certain natural phenomena have the appearance of design. Its genius is in showing how ordered complexity can emerge from random fundamental processes. But on this point of information transmission specifically, I can certainly do no better than deferring to Genetically Modified Skeptics video, since he enlisted the help of John Perry from Stated Clearly, and I will simply never be able to speak more competently than him on biology. Linked in the description.
The biggest scientific problem for atheists lies in the nature of the universe itself. The Big Bang is the theory that holds that the universe began with the explosion outward.
Who cares about the Big Bang? Any fucking theory is better than God.
Of a high-density
Christian
pinpoint of matter,
God.
which sounds an awful...
Like God that fucking hates us. Yeah, I can believe that. Or God that just randomly farted and this universe popped out. Yeah, this is something I can also believe. God that is absolutely fucking neutral to our existence, that just does not care. Yes, this is quite probable. Christian God, no fucking chance.
lot like the creation story at the beginning of the Bible.
How does an entire universe full of energy simply appear out of nothing?
The original skepticism of the Big Bang Theory was driven in large measure by objections to that similarity. The very specific conditions under which our universe was created that allowed for the development of intelligent human life are often used by believers as proof of God's hand. The so-called fine-tuning of the universe for life is extraordinary. If, for example, the strength of the Big Bang had differed by 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, the universe just would not exist the way that it does right now.
If the deistic God thought all that through and set up the laws of physics, then he would have to be damn clever.
Atheists claim that
Clever.
just because you won the lottery doesn't mean
Laughable.
that because somebody intended for you to win the lottery, somebody had to win. But that doesn't answer the question. If you kept winning the lottery over and over and over and over again, billions of times, at some point you might suppose that somebody was cheating.
Okay, I've discussed and debated the fine-tuning argument before, but Ben seems to have chosen the most dubious response to it, and said that this is what atheists claim. Specifically, the idea that the fine-tuning of the constants is actually random, and we just got lucky. The only time that this kind of response is really taken seriously is when it's presented in the context of a multiverse. Of course, if there's only one universe, and the constants of gravity, expansion rate, strong and weak nuclear forces, etc., could have actually been anything, and just happened by chance to be perfect for a life-permitting universe, this chance would be so infinitesimally small that I couldn't even take it seriously. But 2 problems. First, it may be that if the constants differed even slightly, then the universe as we know it couldn't exist. But it's a different claim to say say that they could have differed even slightly. So one line of argument suggests that the constants ought to be of the values that they have, perhaps because of some undiscovered underlying law, or perhaps because they're all, in fact, expressions of the same law. And we may need to still explain that law, of course, but at least there would only be one thing to explain, not a multitude of constants. But more commonly, it's suggested that if there's more than one universe, then if they all have a random assortment of constant values, chances are at least one of them will get lucky, as it were. Ben says that it's more like getting lucky over and over and over again, which is true. I mean, the chances are tiny. But if the number of universes is infinite or near infinite, then we can guarantee that such an outcome would happen at least once. Of course, I want to resist invoking a multiverse as a kind of disposal problem for the fine-tuning argument. I think we should only seriously consider it as an option if we have independent reason to think that such a multiverse exists, and not just consider it as an ad hoc means of getting out of the fine-tuning argument. There's a lot more to say about this argument, but I've discussed it before, and doubtless will do again. I'll put links in the description that might be relevant. But look, it's a good argument. I won't deny that. There are lots of good arguments for God's existence, and I hope you don't expect me to treat every single argument presented as if it's complete trash just because I'm an atheist and I'm trying to make a video. But again, I would hardly consider the matter settled, at least as settled as Ben seems to think that it is.
Then there's the question of human consciousness.
Why are we conscious? Right now, nobody knows the answers.
Scientists have presented many theories about it, but none has been sufficient to explain how consciousness arises out of the physical processes of the brain. Physicist Roger Penrose explained, quote, "We need a major revolution in our understanding of the physical world in order to accommodate consciousness." Even Richard Dawkins admits that the development of consciousness is, quote, "to me, the most profound mystery facing modern biology."
Ben quotes Penrose and Dawkins here, both non-believers by the way, as saying that consciousness is a great mystery that science is yet to explain. But just like earlier, where Ben would bring up a problem of science or philosophy and say that atheism fails to account for it, he himself simply fails to show why God would help us to do so. And maybe God's existence can help us explain the mystery of consciousness. But Ben provided no argument, nor even hinted at an argument, that this is the case. And perhaps worse still, by using these quotes, Ben seems to be suggesting that because we have a phenomenon which science has, at least as of yet, failed to comprehensively explain, we ought to resort to theism, which is the definition of a God of the gaps argument. So I'm not so sure about that one either. Now, in the rest of this video, Ben makes just two more points. First, that the problem of evil doesn't disprove God's existence entirely. And second, that religious people doing bad things shouldn't make us think that God doesn't exist. I agree with both of these claims, more or less, but I'm just not going to get into the problem of evil here. I just released an hour-long podcast on the topic and have debated it, frankly, ad nauseum, so you can get my thoughts from those past videos and discussions if you're interested. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our sweeping journey through reason, free will, morality, change, Parmenides and Aristotle, Ed Feser and Graham Oppy, theories of time and the limits of mathematics. Who'd have thought all of this could come from a Ben Shapiro video? I've had a great time making this one, and if you do enjoy my content, please consider becoming a financial supporter at patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic. And special thanks as always to my top tier patrons for keeping this channel afloat. I've been Alex O'Connor. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
What else should we try in the variant? In the variant, maybe we should try. Maybe we should try again with spam 2. And just spam. Oh wait, I'm with no click. That means bit help. Sorry for that, I got really scared. Oh, need a break. Yeah, very helpful to fucking detox from religion. Maybe that is enough for now. What do you think? Maybe yes. Maybe yes. Yeah, let's end it here. I wanna go and relax.